My daughter found out about my secret same-gender affair. Now she's gone, and I don't know if I'll ever see her again. It started as an ordinary day, the kind that blends into a blur when you've been living the same routine for years. But looking back, I can see now it was the beginning of everything unraveling. For as long as I can remember, my daughter Sophie and I were a team. It was just the two of us after her father left when she was still a baby. I did everything I could to raise her right, to make her feel loved and supported. And for the most part, I thought I had done a good job. Sophie was brilliant, not just academically, though her grades were near perfect, but in the way she approached life. She was vibrant, curious, always chasing the next big challenge. Music was her passion, and I was endlessly proud of her talent on the piano. But raising her on my own wasn't easy. Somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing my own needs. I hadn't dated in years, hadn't even thought about myself as someone who deserved that kind of connection. Everything I did revolved around Sophie. Then Claire came into our lives. Sophie had been struggling with a particularly challenging piece for an upcoming recital. She begged me to hire someone to help, and I found Claire through a local music school. She was in her mid-20s, just a few years older than Sophie, with a magnetic personality that made people instantly gravitate toward her. I remember thinking she seemed like exactly the kind of person Sophie needed, a mentor who could inspire her. At first, that's all Claire was, a mentor. She came over twice a week for lessons, patiently guiding Sophie through every mistake and helping her polish her performance. But it didn't take long for Claire to become a part of our lives outside of music. She'd stay for dinner after lessons, chatting with us like an old friend. Sometimes she'd bring over her favorite books or music to share with Sophie. And then there were the times when Sophie was busy practicing, and Claire would sit with me in the living room. It started with casual conversation, her asking about my work, me asking about her dreams as a musician. But as the weeks went on, our talks became deeper, more personal. She made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years, and when she listened, she really listened. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was paying attention to me. At the time, I didn't see it for what it was. I told myself it was nothing more than a friendship. But looking back now, I realized I had already started to fall for her. It wasn't obvious at first, at least not to me. Claire was young, vibrant, and full of energy, everything I wasn't anymore. I'd spent years pouring every ounce of myself into being Sophie's mom. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped thinking of myself as anything else. But when Claire was around, it was like she saw me for who I was beyond that role. She'd ask questions about my life, my dreams, my struggles, even my regrets. No one had asked me those kinds of things in years. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Claire stayed late. We ended up on the couch, talking about everything and nothing all at once. She told me about her childhood, how she'd grown up surrounded by music, and how it had saved her during some of her darkest moments. I told her about the day Sophie's father walked out, how terrified I'd been to raise a child on my own, how I had spent every moment since trying to prove to myself that I could do it. She reached out and put her hand over mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the air shifted between us. Then she leaned in and kissed me. I froze. For a split second, my brain screamed at me to stop, to tell her this was a mistake. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed her back. When she pulled away, I felt like the world had tilted on its axis. I couldn't look at her, couldn't even think straight. All I managed to say was that Sophie couldn't know. Claire nodded, her face soft with understanding. That night, I told myself it was a one-time mistake, a moment of weakness. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I wish I could say it ended there, that I came to my senses and stopped things before they went any further. But it didn't. After that kiss, Claire and I started finding excuses to spend more time together. When Sophie was at school, Claire would stop by to chat or drop off sheet music Sophie might need. Sometimes, I'd meet her at a coffee shop on the other side of town, far enough away that no one would recognize us. It felt dangerous, exhilarating, and completely wrong. We told ourselves we were being careful, that Sophie wouldn't notice. But looking back, I think we both knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks started to show. One afternoon, Sophie came home earlier than expected. She found Claire's bright red scarf draped over the back of the couch. It was unmistakable, the kind of thing that demanded attention. I saw her glance at it, her brow furrowing slightly as her eyes lingered. She didn't say anything then, but I could tell the thought had planted itself in her mind. After that day, the questions started. At first, they were subtle, her way of probing, trying to piece things together. I gave vague answers, brushing off her concerns, hoping to shift her attention elsewhere. But Sophie wasn't someone who let things slide. I could see the suspicion growing in her every time she looked at me. The tension between us became impossible to ignore. Then came the night everything fell apart. One evening, Sophie came home earlier than expected. Claire and I were in the living room, talking quietly on the couch. The house was quiet, the kind of calm that made me forget, just for a moment, how fragile everything had become. She leaned in, laughing at something I had just said, her eyes warm and full of something I hadn't felt in years. Before I realized it, I leaned in too. It was a brief kiss, just a soft meeting of lips, but it felt like the room had shifted, like the air had thickened. When I opened my eyes, Sophie was standing in the doorway. She looked frozen, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, I thought I was imagining her. This couldn't be real. But then she blinked, her expression twisting into something that made my stomach drop. She had seen everything. I pulled away from Claire immediately, standing up so fast that I nearly stumbled. My heart was pounding as I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Sophie didn't say anything. She just stared at us, her gaze darting between Claire and me like she was trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. I could see the questions forming in her mind, the betrayal, the disbelief. Finally, she turned and stormed out of the room. Panic surged through me, and I followed her, calling her name, my voice shaking. She grabbed her coat and flung the door open. At the doorway, she finally stopped. I didn't need her to say anything. I could feel the question lingering between us. How could you? Sophie didn't yell or cry. She just stood there, frozen in place, her expression cutting through me like a blade. I tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly justify what I had done? She didn't need to say anything. Her face said it all. The betrayal, the disbelief, the hurt. After what felt like an eternity, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in my room, drowning in the silence she left behind. The next few days were unbearable. Sophie avoided me at every turn, shutting herself in her room or leaving the house without a word. She barely acknowledged my presence, and when she did, it was with a cold, detached look that made my stomach twist. The door slammed shut behind her, and I was left standing there, the silence in the house now unbearable. After Sophie walked out that night, the house felt hollow. The sound of the doors slamming echoed in my head long after she had gone, a sharp reminder of everything I had just lost. I spent the next hour pacing around the house, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. Her face, the way her voice cracked when she asked how I could do this to her, it was all seared into my memory. I tried calling her. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone, but it didn't matter. She didn't pick up. Every call went straight to voicemail. Claire stayed with me that night, her face pale, her voice quiet as she tried to reassure me that Sophie just needed time. She believed that Sophie would come back when she was ready. But her words felt hollow, like they were meant more to soothe herself than to convince me. I couldn't stop thinking about the look in Sophie's eyes. It wasn't just hurt. It was something deeper. Something that told me I had crossed a line I could never uncross. The next morning, I woke up hoping to find Sophie in her room. For a moment, I thought I'd walk in and see her curled up under her blankets, hiding from the world like she always did when she needed space. But the room was empty. Her bed was still made, Her favorite hoodie was gone from the back of her chair, and the absence of her presence hit me like a physical blow. The realization sank in with a sickening clarity. She wasn't just gone for the night. She was leaving. When I found her, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a suitcase by her side. Her face was calm, almost unnervingly so, as if she had been preparing for this moment for weeks. I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding as I tried to figure out what to say to stop her. She stood up before I could speak, grabbing the handle of her suitcase without sparing me a glance. Her movements were deliberate, her resolve unshakable. She was going to stay with her father. That was the decision she had made, and I knew there was no point in arguing. The weight of her choice crushed me. Sophie barely knew her father. He had been absent for most of her life. Yet, in this moment, he was the better option. I tried to plead with her, to tell her that we could fix this, that I was sorry for everything. But she didn't respond. She didn't even look up. She walked past me, her suitcase rolling behind her. At the door, she paused for a moment, and for a second I thought she might turn back. But she didn't. The silence that followed was deafening. The house felt unbearably empty after that. It wasn't just the silence. It was the weight of knowing she wasn't coming back. Every time I walked past her room, I half expected to see her there, sitting on her bed with her headphones on, scribbling in her journal. But the room stayed empty, a stark reminder of everything I had lost. I tried calling her, texting her, even reaching out through her father. But Sophie stayed silent. She had shut me out completely, and the emptiness she left behind was overwhelming. Weeks turned into months, and the silence became suffocating. I threw myself into work, into cleaning, into anything that might distract me from the emptiness that had settled into my life. But no matter how busy I kept myself, it wasn't enough. Every quiet moment brought me back to Sophie, to the last words she had spoken, the quiet devastation in her eyes. Claire tried to help, but even her presence began to feel like a constant reminder of everything I had ruined. At first, she was patient. She'd hold me when I cried, tell me that Sophie would come around eventually. But her reassurances felt thin, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. The weight of what had happened hung between us, an unspoken tension that only grew heavier with time. One afternoon, while cleaning out the closet in Sophie's room, I found one of her old journals. I sat down on the edge of her bed and opened it, flipping through pages filled with messy handwriting, little doodles in the margins, and lists of things she wanted to accomplish. At first, it was just typical teenage aspirations, places she wanted to visit, things she wanted to learn, goals for her future. But then I came across a list that stopped me cold. At the very bottom, scrawled in her familiar handwriting, was the phrase, "Spend more time with Mom." It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the words, trying to understand how I had let things get to this point. She had wanted to spend more time with me, and I had thrown that chance away. Finding that list broke something inside me. I had spent so much time convincing myself that Sophie was fine, that she didn't need me as much as she used to. But the truth was staring at me from those pages. She had wanted more of me, and I hadn't been there. I sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the journal, as memories of her flooded back. The way she used to curl up next to me on the couch when she was younger, how she'd ask me to braid her hair before school, the nights we'd stay up late laughing about nothing. How had I let all of that slip away? After that, I started writing letters to her. I didn't know if she'd ever read them, but I needed to get the words out. Every week, I'd sit down and pour my heart into those letters. I wrote about how much I missed her, how sorry I was, and how much I regretted everything that had happened. I told her about the nights I lay awake thinking about her, the moments I replayed in my head, wishing I could go back and make different choices. I apologized over and over, even though I knew it wouldn't change anything. At first, I thought about sending them, but every time I sealed one in an envelope, I hesitated. I didn't want to force myself back into her life if she wasn't ready. So the letters stayed in a drawer, piling up week after week. In some small way, writing them helped. It was like I was finally confronting everything I had tried so hard to avoid. Claire tried to be supportive, but even she could feel the weight of my guilt. There were moments when she'd reach out to comfort me, but the space between us had grown too wide. I could see the doubt in her eyes, even when she didn't say it out loud. I think she felt guilty too, like maybe if she hadn't kissed me that night, none of this would have happened. But the truth was, the blame wasn't hers to carry. I had made my choices, and now I had to live with the consequences. The hardest part was not knowing if Sophie would ever come back. Every day, I checked my phone, hoping for a text, a call, some sign that she was ready to talk. But it never came. The weeks turned into months, and the silence became harder to bear. Each passing day felt like I was drifting further away from her, like the bridge between us was crumbling beyond repair. As the months dragged on, hope began to slip away. Every morning, I'd wake up with the same thought. Maybe today will be the day she calls. Maybe there would be a text waiting on my phone, or a knock at the door, or something, anything that told me Sophie wanted me back in her life. But every day, there was nothing. The house felt emptier than ever. Even when Claire was there, it didn't feel the same. The weight of Sophie's absence hung over everything, a constant reminder of the void I had created. Eventually, Claire and I tried to move forward. About a year after Sophie left, Claire proposed. It wasn't the kind of romantic moment you'd expect. There was no grand gesture, no sweeping declaration. It was quiet, almost hesitant, as if she was afraid of what my answer might be. I said yes, not because I was sure, but because I wanted to believe I could still build something good out of the wreckage. We got married a few months later. It was a small ceremony, with just a few friends and Claire's family. Sophie wasn't there, of course. I didn't even tell her about it. Part of me felt guilty for moving forward without her, but another part of me told myself I didn't have a choice. Life had to go on. A year after that, Claire and I had a daughter. She was everything I didn't know I needed, bright and curious, with a laugh that filled the house. She brought so much life into our world, but even her joy couldn't fill the space Sophie had left behind. No matter how hard I tried to focus on my new family, there was always a piece of me that felt missing. I kept writing letters to Sophie. Even after years of silence, I couldn't stop. I wrote about the baby, about my regrets, about how much I missed her. I poured my heart into every word, knowing she might never read them. The letters became a ritual, a way for me to stay connected to her, even if it was only in my mind. And then, one evening, everything changed. It had been almost 4 years since Sophie left. I was cleaning up after dinner when my phone buzzed on the counter. At first, I thought it was just a notification, an email, or a random message from Claire. But when I picked it up, my breath caught in my throat. Sophie's name was on the screen. I stared at the screen, unsure if I was imagining it. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, pictured it in 1,000 different ways. But now that it was happening, I didn't know how to feel. My hands shook as I unlocked the phone and opened her message. It was simple, almost casual. I'm going to be in town on Friday. Can we meet? I must have reread it a dozen times, my mind racing. After all this time, she wanted to see me. I typed back quickly, my fingers trembling. Of course. Just let me know when and where. A few minutes later, she responded with the name of a coffee shop downtown and a time, noon. I stared at her reply for what felt like forever. What did this mean? Was she coming to forgive me? To reconnect? Or was this her way of saying goodbye for good? The next few days were agonizing. I couldn't focus on anything, work, the house, or even my daughter. My thoughts were consumed by Sophie. The idea of seeing her again was both thrilling and terrifying. Claire noticed, of course. She asked me if something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. This meeting wasn't about her. It wasn't about us. It was about Sophie and me, and I needed to face it alone. Friday finally came, and I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early. I chose a booth near the window and sat there fidgeting. Every time the door opened, my heart leapt, only to sink again when it wasn't her. For a brief moment, I wondered if she might not show up. Then, right at noon, she walked in. She looked different, yet exactly the same. Sophie had always carried herself with a quiet confidence, even as a teenager, and now that confidence seemed more pronounced. She was older, more composed, and there was a maturity in her expression that took my breath away. But her eyes, those were the same. Deep, thoughtful, and filled with emotions I couldn't quite read. When she spotted me, she walked over with measured steps, her face giving nothing away. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I stood up instinctively, wanting to hug her, but I stopped myself. I didn't know how she'd react, and I didn't want to risk pushing her away. Instead, I nodded and sat back down as she slid into the booth across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I had spent years rehearsing this moment in my head, what I would say, how I would apologize, how I would explain myself. But now that she was sitting in front of me, my mind went blank. I finally broke the silence by asking her how she had been. Her response was polite but distant. She mentioned work, how busy life had been, and nothing more. It was the kind of answer you'd give to a stranger, and it stung. I wanted to ask so many questions. Was she happy? Did she ever think about me? Could she forgive me? But I held back, afraid of overwhelming her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sophie leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. She told me she wanted to understand how it had happened, how things between Claire and me had started. The question hit me like a freight train. I had assumed we would talk about the fallout, about how much I missed her or how sorry I was. I hadn't expected her to ask about the details of my relationship with Claire. I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. I told her the truth, that it hadn't been planned, that it had just happened. I admitted that I hadn't meant for things to go as far as they did. But the words felt inadequate, hollow. Her expression didn't change, but I could see the hurt flickering in her eyes. Even though Sophie's face remained composed, I could see the hurt in her eyes. It was the kind of pain that comes from betrayal, a deep wound that no words could heal. She asked me about all the times I had told her I was busy with work or out with friends. Her voice didn't rise, but there was an edge to it, sharp enough to cut through my defenses. Had those times been lies, just excuses to be with Claire? The question hung in the air like a stone, sinking into my chest. I nodded, my throat tight, and admitted the truth. Yes, I had lied to her. I wanted to tell her that I hadn't meant for it to happen, that I hadn't realized how much I was hurting her at the time. But none of that mattered now. The damage had already been done. Sophie stayed quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting away from mine. Then she spoke, her voice calm but heavy with emotion. She told me she wasn't angry that I had moved on, or even that I had found someone. What hurt her was that I had put my relationship with Claire before my relationship with her. I had chosen someone else over my own daughter, and that was something she couldn't forgive. Her words hit me like a brick, leaving me struggling to breathe. I tried to plead with her, to tell her how much I regretted everything, but she held up her hand, cutting me off. She said she hadn't come for an apology. She had come for closure. Sophie looked me in the eye then, her expression unreadable, and told me she had made peace with what had happened. But she didn't want me in her life anymore. She had moved on, and she thought I should too. And with that, she stood up. I wanted to stop her, to beg her to reconsider, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. She had made up her mind, and there was nothing I could say to change it. Sophie walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, leaving me sitting there, feeling like my heart had been ripped out of my chest. I stayed in that booth long after she left, unable to move, unable to think. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, imagined it as the start of healing, a chance to reconnect with my daughter. Instead, it was the end. I had no one to blame but myself. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them, so please leave a comment. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories like this one.